Stanley Druckenmiller gave a speech at USC, and he expressed concern about the financial crisis that could occur in the 2025 to 2035 period due to the baby boomers turning 65 and the impact on entitlements. He predicted that in 25 years, spending on seniors will grow to 60% of all taxes. About 5% of our GDP goes to Social Security today, and about another 5.5 goes to Medicare, Medicaid, and it's predicting here that those combined will go from what looks like 12% today up to 24% of GDP. Your reaction, Freeberg?
I mean, my reaction is it is another very important voice stating the obvious. Like, the arithmetic just doesn't work. When we had RFK on last week, I prodded him on his stance and point of view on the federal deficit, the fiscal deficit this government runs, and the entitlement programs that are only going to swell, and the debt burden, which has an interest payment obligation on it, that the interest payments are swelling. And when you do the arithmetic on all this, it's going to balloon the cost to service the debt. And without some degree of cutting across the board spending and entitlement programs, discretionary spending and entitlement programs, you can't make the interest payments, which all, inevitably leads to some form of default. So that's just the math and the way this all works out. And I think what he's done is put a pen to paper and shown that, call it roughly 2025 to 2035, you start to run into that fiscal scenario where, you can no longer generate enough income from the U.S. economy to fund both the interest payment obligations on the federal debt as well as these entitlement programs. And something's got to give. Either you're going to have to default on the debt or you're going to have to cut the entitlement programs. And the point he's making is that the longer you wait to cut the entitlement programs, the worse it's going to get because you're accruing so much debt in the interim. And as we know, that becomes very politically unpopular. And what's so scary to me, and I've kind of shared this, and obviously Chamath has a different point of view, but it feels to me like this is that Don't Look Up movie moment where we have this looming disaster. We don't have any fuel in the car. And all that everyone's talking about is where are we going to drive the car? And every political conversation, every candidate gets on stage, gets on a podcast, gets on a TV show, and they talk about stuff that is simply not feasible. And the direction setting with respect to social policy, wars, geopolitics, how are we going to take care of our middle class? None of that stuff is possible to actually execute against without recognizing and acknowledging that we don't have gas in the car and we have to figure out how to gas up the car. And so it's great to see Druckenmiller being vocal, putting very simple, clear slides together. It's like what I've mentioned in the past. I would love to see a Bill Clinton-esque slide deck where he would come up with a poster and show everyone, here's the economy, folks. And I think Druckenmiller did a great job, and I encourage everyone to go watch that. There's an audio transcript of the talk as well as the slides are publicly available on the internet. We'll put the links in the show notes here today. I just think it's whether or not you agree with the outlook, I think it's worth everyone watching and realizing how serious of an issue this is and why this has to become the number one topic of conversation going into this next presidential election cycle.
He's also disclosed he's short the dollar, long gold, euro, oil, and AUD, which I guess is the Australian dollar. And he's also long NVIDIA and Microsoft. Believes NVIDIA's got a monopoly on the chip market. I got a question for Chamath and then to Sachs. So Chamath, what's your just reaction to this? Do you think he's Dr. Dooming it and we can have all this debt? And then the question then becomes, is there any way out of this? We had a Trump town hall. I hate to bring it up and go back into, the sort of Trump commentary and all this, but he's the lead candidate, Sachs. And he said he thinks we can get out of debt. We just got to drill a bunch of oil, drill baby drill, and we'll get out of this problem. We'll be able to rebalance the budget. So Chamath and then Sachs.
I want to be clear. I don't think it's great that we have these enormous debts and entitlement obligations. But I also don't think that there's some magical number where the economy breaks. And the reason is because we're central to not just our economy, but everybody else's economy. We are the reserve currency of the world. It's not changing anytime soon. It's not even close. And we are, for better or worse, and I think Sachs and I don't like it, but we are the world's policeman. We are a bunch of things. We are the world's center of innovation. We are the world's center of these great leaps forward in humanity. When we talk about all of these different things, these aren't coming from random countries. they're coming from the United States. We can debate which company, but we're never debating the country. So I think that there's a legacy of value creation and innovation that we've always been at the forefront of, at least since America was founded, so 1776 to now. I think the reality is that debt to GDP will continue to increase. I don't think a single politician can practically get elected by offering to cut entitlement spending to people that have spent their entire lives paying into a system. So as a practical matter, this thing will go up, and I don't think the economy will stop. I think that economics are a relative problem where you have to weigh countries against each other. And what that means is the economic vibrancy, the productivity, the intellect, all of those things where we have to compete with El Salvador, we have to compete with Nigeria, we have to compete with India, we have to compete with Australia. And in that context, there is very little historical artifact that says that there's a breaking point. So I just think that if you observe the moment, it's not that what Friedberg is saying is bad. I'm not exactly sure that it's particularly actionable. And I think the disproportionate amount of action is actually the opposite, which is to reinflate the money supply, to reinflate assets, to create artificial prosperity and smear it to many, many, many people. And I think that you have to think about how do you want to activate your view? I can believe whatever I want, but at the end of the day, I don't want to act in a way that's against my economic best interest, quite honestly. So I believe that winning is measured in dollars and cents on these things. And from that perspective, I don't particularly like it. I think I'm emotionally more aligned to Friedberg, but the practical reality is I'm on the opposite side, which says the governments will keep spending, inflation will be here, assets will keep inflating, the M2 money supply will keep going up, and on general, I'm long the United States and short every other country.
Chamath, doesn't that ultimately lead to just inflation? It initially starts at the inflation of assets and asset prices, but it ultimately leads to the inflation of goods and services, which can cripple the economy because then, the middle class can't afford things and you have economic slowdown. I mean, that's the historical record of having these kind of inflationary moments.
Yeah, I mean, inflation comes and goes, but the position of the American US dollar hasn't changed. Again, you have to remember, like a lot of these foreign governments, 187 or whatever the number is, countries outside the United States, rely on the US dollar. They don't want to own their own currency, right? And so, yeah, you're right. Dollars do get inflated, but that increased purchasing power also actually drives the balance of power back to the United States because all of these other folks all of a sudden find the ability to import a little bit cheaper. Their economies get slightly better, but the US dollar actually still does well. So there's a complex set of interactions that are all relative. So I think it's very hard to point to the US middle class and say, oh, this is why the US breaks. I just don't see very many good examples in a modern globalist era. And there are examples, and I think Ray Dalio has pointed these out, when you look all the way in the back. But to use the UK, right, in the 15 and 1600s of the East India Trading Company, when we did not have a global economy or a global reserve currency, I don't think it's very useful. There's things you can learn. Taxation, I think we can learn about why taxation does kill innovation. You said that before. I agree with that. But I don't think there's much value in saying because it happened in these moments, it's going to happen exactly the same way here. And I think what people don't understand is we are in a unitary, singular, mono economy that is anchored by the US dollar.
Sachs, any thoughts?
Sachs, do you agree?
I tend to be on the Friedberg-Druckenmiller side of this thing. Druckenmiller had a great quote in this interview he just gave. I don't know, Friedberg, did you mention this last week? That he said that he compared the debt ceiling and fiscal spending to worrying about whether a 30-foot wave will damage the pier when you know there's a 200-foot tsunami just 10 miles out.
Yeah, I saw that quote.
So what he's saying is, like, our short-term situation is bad. The long-term situation, which isn't even that long-term, like 10 years out, is even worse. And I think there's a growing feeling that our political system is just not up to the challenge of dealing with these problems.